She had no army, no title, no voice in the law, but she had something far more powerful, a relentless will to protect what she built. In a world that tried to silence her, she chose to stand, fight, and prove them all wrong. Stay with me, because this story might change the way you see strength forever.
The wind howled off the Rockies, a sharp, bitter sound. It was the kind of cold that killed men. It killed cattle faster. March in the Colorado Territory wasn't spring. It was winter's last desperate fight. Eleanor Montgomery knelt in the freezing mud of the folding barn. Her breath came in short white clouds. Her hands were slick with blood and afterbirth. Beneath her, a newborn calf shivered, its breathing shallow. Too shallow. "Come on," Eleanor whispered. Her voice was rough, tired. "Don't you quit on me." She grabbed a rough burlap sack. She rubbed the calf's ribs, hard, vigorous, getting the blood moving. She had been awake for 22 hours. Her back ached. Her knuckles were cracked and bleeding. But this was the Double M Ranch. You didn't sleep when there was life on the line. Samuel had taught her that. And when Samuel died, she just kept doing it. Standing a few feet away, clutching a lantern with trembling hands, was Abigail Preston. Abby was 28, a newlywed from the neighboring spread. Her husband had gone to Denver for supplies, leaving her alone with a sick herd. She had ridden over in the dead of night, terrified, asking for the widow Montgomery. "Is he going to make it, Ellie?" Abby asked. Her voice shook. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer. "Lord, please, we can't lose any more." Eleanor stopped rubbing. The calf gave a sudden, sharp cough. It blinked. Then, slowly, it tried to lift its head. Life. Eleanor sat back on her heels. She wiped her forehead with the back of a bloody wrist. She looked up at the younger woman. Abby was still praying. "Abby, look at me." Abby opened her eyes. They were wide, scared. Eleanor pointed to the calf. "He's breathing because we cleared his lungs and kept his blood pumping, not because of the sky." She stood up. Her joints popped. She grabbed a towel and began wiping her hands. She stepped closer to the younger woman. The lantern light caught the hard, unrelenting amber of Eleanor's eyes. "You came to me last night asking about the sickness spreading up from the south," Eleanor said. Her voice was low, steady. It cut right through the howling wind outside. "You were crying, praying it wouldn't hit your husband's herd. But I need you to listen to me right now. I need you to hear exactly what I am saying." Abby swallowed hard. She nodded. "Abigail, remember this," Eleanor said, speaking the words like gospel. "Texas fever isn't a curse from God. It's science. It's tick-borne. If you don't establish a 30-mile quarantine buffer and control the water supply the minute their droppings turn green, the whole herd dies. Scientific knowledge will save this ranch, not empty prayers." Abby stared at her. The words sank in, heavy, real. "A 30-mile buffer," Abby repeated softly. "Yes," Eleanor said. "You don't wait for them to stumble. You don't wait for them to fall. The minute the droppings turn green, you isolate. You cut off the water they share with the healthy cows. You burn the brush where the ticks breed. You do it fast. You do it without hesitation. That is how you survive out here. God helps the rancher who understands quarantine protocols." Abby nodded again. The fear in her eyes was still there, but the panic was gone, replaced by something else, a quiet understanding. "Thank you, Ellie," Abby whispered. Eleanor just nodded. She turned back to the calf. It was trying to stand now, wobbly but fighting, just like her. 2 days later. The Cimarron County Cattlemen's Association. The town hall smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and men. Dozens of men. They sat on hard wooden benches, their hats resting on their knees. These were the men who owned the valley, the men who controlled the beef. Eleanor sat in the very back row. She wore a dark blue dress, high collar, simple. She didn't wear it to look pretty. She wore it to blend in, to be invisible. In 1878, a woman in a room full of cattlemen was either an annoyance or a distraction. Eleanor chose to be a shadow. Up at the front of the room stood Silas Montgomery. Silas, her late husband's younger brother. Silas didn't have calluses on his hands. He had never pulled a calf from the mud. He had never smelled the foul, sweet stench of a dying herd. Silas lived in Pueblo. He wore a tailored wool suit. He carried a silver pocket watch. He was a lawyer, a man of paper and ink. But right now, he was playing the cowboy king. "Gentlemen," Silas said. His voice was smooth, cultured. It projected beautifully across the smoky room. "Let us talk about the upcoming season. Let us talk about survival." The men nodded. They liked Silas. He bought them whiskey. He spoke well. He made them feel secure. 3 years ago, Silas continued, pacing slowly across the front of the hall, we faced the greatest threat this county has ever seen. The fever of '75. It wiped out herds from Texas to Wyoming. It left good men bankrupt. It left families starving. Eleanor sat perfectly still. She didn't blink. She knew what was coming. "But not here," Silas said. He stopped pacing. He looked out at the crowd, a proud, humble smile playing on his lips. "Not in Cimarron, because we took action. We established the 30-mile buffer. We monitored the herds. We controlled the water." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. Her knuckles turned white. "It was a difficult decision," Silas said, pressing a hand to his chest. "When I drafted those quarantine protocols for the Double M and shared them with this association, I knew it would be hard labor. But leadership requires hard choices, and thanks to those protocols, our county lost less than 5% of its cattle." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Several men clapped. Josiah Blackwood, a massive man who owned the largest spread to the east, nodded respectfully at Silas. "Good foresight, Montgomery," Blackwood rumbled. "Saved my bacon, that's for sure." Silas bowed his head. "Just doing my part for the community, Josiah." In the back row, Eleanor couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like ash in her lungs. Silas wasn't even in Cimarron County in 1875. He was in Denver, attending a political banquet. It was Eleanor who had stayed awake for 4 days straight. It was Eleanor who had written letters to the Department of Agriculture. It was Eleanor who had read the German veterinary journals by candlelight. It was Eleanor who had physically ridden out and drawn the quarantine lines in the dirt, threatening to shoot any man who moved a sick cow across her border. She had built the system. She had saved the valley. And Silas was wearing her victory like a cheap suit. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to scream. She wanted to march down that center aisle and slap the silver pocket watch right out of his manicured hand. But she didn't. She knew the rules of the game. If she stood up now, she would be the hysterical widow, the emotional woman making a scene. The men would look away in embarrassment. Silas would offer her a patronizing smile and escort her out. She would lose whatever shred of silent respect she held. So, she sat there. She breathed in, she breathed out. She let Silas take the applause. She let him take the credit. But in her mind, she opened her ledger, and she added another debt to Silas Montgomery's name, a debt she fully intended to collect. The sun was dipping behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies when Eleanor finally rode back onto the Double M. The sky was bleeding orange and bruised purple. The air was turning sharp again. She dismounted by the main barn. She didn't hand the reins to a stable boy. She never did. She unsaddled her own horse. She brushed him down. It was the routine that kept her grounded, the rhythm of the work. As she finished hanging the heavy leather saddle, a shadow detached itself from the barn wall. Ezekiel Vance, Everyone called him Zeke. He was 67 years old. His skin looked like old saddle leather left out in the rain. He had been working the Cimarron Basin since 1855, long before Samuel and Eleanor ever rolled up in their wagon. Zeke didn't talk much. He didn't have to. He saw everything. He stepped into the light of her lantern. He held a rolled-up cigarette between his lips, unlit. "Evening, Ellie," Zeke said. His voice was like gravel under a boot. "Evening, Zeke. The south fence hold up?" It held. Zeke took the unlit cigarette from his mouth. He looked out toward the main house, a grand two-story timber place. Eleanor's house. "Your brother-in-law sent a wire," Zeke said. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the house. Eleanor paused. The brush hovered over her horse's flank. "Silas? He was just at the town hall today. What kind of wire?" "Came through the telegraph office in town about an hour after the meeting," Zeke said. "Station master told me when I was picking up the feed." Eleanor waited. She knew better than to rush Zeke. Zeke turned his head slowly. He looked at her. His eyes were dark, ancient. "He hired a man," Zeke said, "a foreman, coming down from Wyoming." Eleanor felt a cold prickle at the back of her neck. "A foreman? I am the foreman of this ranch, Zeke." "Not on paper, Ellie. Not to Silas." Zeke rolled the cigarette between his scarred fingers. "Word is, Silas told him the double M was falling apart. Said it was being run by a grieving widow who didn't know her numbers. Said the place needed a firm hand, a man's hand." Eleanor lowered the brush. The anger from the town hall, the anger she had swallowed down so carefully, began to burn again. A low, hot fire in her gut. "Did you get a name?" she asked. "Harrison Caldwell," Zeke said. "He's got a reputation. Hard man, practical. Fixed up a couple of failing spreads up near Laramie. He knows cattle." "Does he know when he's being lied to?" Zeke struck a match against the barn wall. He lit his cigarette. The flame illuminated his weathered face for a brief second. "Guess we'll find out," Zeke said. He took a drag. The cherry of the cigarette glowed bright red in the gathering dark. "He arrives on Tuesday." Zeke turned and walked away, fading back into the shadows of the ranch he had watched over for 2 decades. Eleanor stood alone in the barn. She looked out at the rolling hills of her property. 420 head of cattle. 9 years of her life. Silas thought she was weak. He thought she would step aside. He thought he could bring in a stranger to take her keys, take her books, take her life. She turned and looked toward the main house. Her house. "Harrison Caldwell," she whispered to the empty barn. She picked up her lantern. She didn't feel tired anymore. The cold didn't bother her. She walked toward the house, her steps measured, heavy, certain. Let him come. Let the Wyoming man come. He was walking into a war he didn't understand, and he was about to find out exactly who built the double M. Harrison Caldwell rode a dun gelding. Deep chest, strong legs, a horse built for miles, not for speed. Harrison was much the same. He was 42. His face was a map of bad weather and hard decisions. He had spent the last 10 years pulling failing ranches out of the mud up in Wyoming. He knew cattle, he knew men, and he thought he knew how the world worked. Right now, the world was telling him a story. He rode beside Silas Montgomery. Silas wore a fine wool suit that caught the dust. He looked entirely out of place on a horse. But Silas was doing all the talking. "It's a tragedy, really," Silas said. He adjusted his bowler hat against the wind. "My brother Samuel built this place with his bare hands, a titan of the territory. When the fever took him, it broke my heart, but it broke his wife's mind." Harrison didn't say anything. He just looked at the land. The Double M Ranch stretched out before them. It didn't look like a tragedy. It looked like an empire. Harrison saw the irrigation ditches, deep, clean, flowing straight from the aquifer. He saw the winter fencing, sturdy cedar posts, tight wire. He saw the cattle grazing in the lower basin, Angus and Hereford crosses, fat, healthy, their coats thick against the March chill. "Place looks solid," Harrison rumbled. His voice was thick, like old timber. "Momentum," Silas said smoothly. He waved a gloved hand. "The sheer momentum of Samuel's genius. It carries the place forward. But that momentum is dying, Harrison. The widow, Eleanor. She tries. Lord knows she tries. But she's emotional, erratic. She clings to the ledger books like a child to a blanket. The men don't respect her. The herd is on the verge of collapse. I need a firm hand to step in. A man's hand. I need you to save my brother's legacy." Harrison nodded slowly. It made sense. A grieving widow in over her head, a brother trying to do right by the family. It was a story as old as the dirt beneath his horse's hooves. It fit the map in his head. They rode into the main yard. The ranch hands were working. Zeke Vance was oiling a saddle near the barn. Two younger hands were fixing a wagon wheel. They looked up as Silas and Harrison rode in. Their eyes were flat, hard. They didn't tip their hats. Harrison noticed that. Good hands usually respected the owner. These men looked at Silas like he was a stray dog near the meat house. "Come inside," Silas said, dismounting awkwardly. "Let's get out of this God-forsaken wind. We can talk terms." They walked up the steps of the main house, a grand two-story timber build. Inside, it smelled of pine smoke and strong coffee. The floors were swept clean. Silas led the way into the dining room. He sat at the head of a massive oak table. He gestured for Harrison to take the seat to his right. "I'll have Eleanor bring us some coffee," Silas said. He didn't shout. He didn't go look for her. He just waited. A moment later, the kitchen door swung open. Eleanor Montgomery walked in. Harrison looked at her. He expected a frail, weeping woman in black. He expected someone bent by grief. Eleanor wasn't bent. She stood straight. Her shoulders were square. She wore a dark blue work dress, an apron stained with dirt and a faint smear of dried blood. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her eyes were amber, sharp, like a hawk watching a field mouse. She carried a heavy silver tray with a tin pot and two ceramic mugs. "Harrison," Silas said, his voice dripping with forced pity. "This is Eleanor, my late brother's widow." He turned to Eleanor. He didn't look her in the eye. "Eleanor, this is Harrison Caldwell, our new foreman. He's going to be taking over the heavy lifting. I know you've been struggling. This will let you focus on the house, the cooking, the things you're meant for." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She stepped up to the table. She set the tray down. The metal clinked against the wood. She poured the coffee. Black, steaming. Harrison watched her hands. They weren't soft. They were calloused, scarred. The hands of a roper, a worker. She set a mug in front of Silas. Then she set one in front of Harrison. Her amber eyes met his. Just for a second. It felt like grabbing a live wire. She stepped back and stood near the wall, silent. Silas took a sip of his coffee. He smiled. "Now, to business. Harrison, the operation is massive. 400 head, 3 wells, a dozen hands. I need you to manage all of it. I'll be in Pueblo handling the legalities and the beef contracts. You will be the law out here." Harrison looked down at his black coffee. He looked at the massive map of the property tacked to the wall. He thought about the size of the herd, the miles of fence, the sheer weight of the logistics. He was a good foreman, but he wasn't a miracle worker. A ranch this size needed a team. It needed a master of the house, and it needed someone running the books, managing the supplies, keeping the home fires burning so the men could bleed in the dirt. He looked at Silas. "With respect, Silas," Harrison said. His voice was heavy in the quiet room. "I've seen the spread. I've run the numbers in my head. If I'm taking over an operation this massive, I can't do it alone." "You'll have the hands," Silas said quickly. "Hands take orders," Harrison countered. "I need a partner. I need a wife to stand by me and anchor this estate. Someone to handle the logistics, the ordering, the men's wages, the home front. If you want me to save this place, I need a wife, not a cook. He meant it practically. He meant he needed a traditional ranch wife to play the traditional role so he could play the savior. He didn't look at Eleanor when he said it. He didn't think she mattered. The room went dead silent. Silas smiled, a patronizing, easy smile. I understand, Harrison. Perhaps in time you'll find a suitable woman in town, but for now, slam. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Harrison jumped. Silas spilled his coffee. Eleanor had moved from the wall. She stood at the end of the oak table. In front of her was a leather-bound ledger. It was 4 inches thick. The spine was cracked. The pages were dog-eared. She had thrown it down with the force of a falling anvil. She didn't look at Silas. She looked dead at Harrison. "Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake. It was cold steel sliding out of a leather sheath. "You said you need a wife, not a cook." Harrison stared at her. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. "You think you need a woman to wash your socks and smile while you save the day," Eleanor continued. She leaned forward, her hands resting flat on the heavy ledger. "But what you actually need is a paymaster, and she is standing right in front of you." "Eleanor," Silas started, his face flushing red. "Shut your mouth, Silas," she snapped. She didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes locked on Harrison. "I don't cook for this ranch," Eleanor said. Every word was a hammer blow. "I sustain it. I breathe life into it. You see that book? That ledger holds 9 years of my sweat. It holds the records of 420 head of cattle. It holds the quarantine protocols that saved this valley in '75. It holds a $14,000 net profit, calculated by my own hand. Every single day." Harrison looked down at the ledger. He could see the neat, precise handwriting on the exposed pages, the columns of ink. Perfect. Flawless. "You are standing on my dirt," Eleanor said. She stepped closer. "You are drinking coffee bought with my money. You are looking at fences I paid men to build. Do not come into my home and look past me. Stop looking for a wife to lean on for power, Mr. Caldwell, and learn to respect the woman who holds the very life of this operation in her hands." Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Silas was sputtering, trying to find a legal threat, trying to find his voice. Harrison Caldwell didn't say a word. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at the woman who had written it. The calluses on her hands, the fire in her eyes. The story Silas had told him evaporated. The map in his head tore right down the middle. Eleanor Montgomery wasn't a grieving, broken widow. She was the king of the mountain, and he had just insulted her in her own castle. The cold didn't care about pride. The cattle didn't care about ledgers. The next morning at 4:30, it was pitch black. The wind was still biting. Eleanor pulled her heavy wool coat over her shoulders. She stepped out onto the porch. The world was dark and silent, just the sound of the wind through the pines. She walked to the foaling barn. She checked the calf she had saved 2 days ago. He was nursing, standing firm on his knobby legs. His mother nudged Eleanor's shoulder as she passed. Eleanor patted the cow's thick neck. "Good girl," she whispered. At 5:30, the hands gathered at the cookhouse. Eleanor stood on the porch. She held a small notebook. "Zeke," she called out. Her voice carried easily over the morning wind. "Take 2 men to the North Ridge. Check the water lines. They might have frozen over in the night. Break the ice if you have to." Zeke touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am." "Miller," she pointed to a younger hand. "We've got 3 steers limping in the lower pasture. Hoof rot. Isolate them. Treat them with the blue vitriol solution. I wrote the exact mixture down on the slate by the medicine cabinet. Don't guess. Read it." "Got it, Mrs. Montgomery." Harrison Caldwell stood by the corral. He was holding a cup of coffee, watching. He watched the men. They didn't roll their eyes. They didn't drag their boots. They moved with purpose. They respected her, not because she demanded it, because she knew exactly what she was doing. Eleanor didn't acknowledge Harrison. She walked past him. She headed for the tack room. At 10 o'clock, the sun broke through the clouds. The mud began to thaw. It turned the ranch yard into a slick brown soup. A rider came up the main road. It was Josiah Blackwood, the massive neighbor from the east. He rode a heavy black stallion. Eleanor met him at the gate. Harrison stayed by the barn, pretending to check a cinch strap, listening. "Eleanor," Blackwood said. He didn't dismount. He leaned over the saddle horn. "Water levels in the creek are dropping. Snowpack up high isn't melting fast enough." "I know, Josiah," Eleanor said. She shielded her eyes from the sun. "I checked the gauges yesterday. We're down 2 inches from last week." "I need to open the upper sluice," Blackwood said. "Divert some of your runoff into my holding ponds, just for a week, until the melt starts." It was a bold ask. Water was blood in Colorado. You didn't just give it away. "No," Eleanor said. "Flat. Immediate." Blackwood frowned. His massive shoulders tensed. "Now, Ellie, be reasonable. Silas said—" "Silas isn't here," Eleanor cut him off. "Silas doesn't know the capacity of the upper aquifer. I do. If you open that sluice now, you'll drain the pressure. My north pasture will go dry in 3 days. Your holding ponds will fill, but you'll lose half of it to evaporation in the dirt." She didn't pause. She didn't let him argue. "Instead," Eleanor said, her tone shifting from a wall to a bridge, "send your southern herd down to my property line. The shared creek at the boundary is running deep. I'll pull my fences back 50 yards. Let your cattle drink there for the week. We share the water where it flows naturally. We don't mess with the aquifer. That's the deal." Blackwood stared at her. He calculated the math in his head. He saw the logic. It was fair. It was smart. It kept both herds alive without risking the underground supply. He tipped his hat. "You're a hard woman to best, Eleanor. I'll send the boys down this afternoon." He turned his horse and rode off. Harrison stood by the barn. His coffee was cold. He dumped it in the dirt. He had watched her diagnose cattle. He had watched her deploy men. He had just watched her negotiate a water treaty with the toughest rancher in the county, using nothing but math and a spine of steel. She wasn't just the paymaster. She was the general. By 8 o'clock that night, Eleanor was exhausted. Her bones ached. Her feet throbbed. She sat at her desk in the study. A single kerosene lamp burned. She opened her massive ledger. She picked up her pen. Every nail bought. Every wage paid. Every calf born. She wrote it down. It was her proof of existence. There was a soft knock at the open door. Eleanor looked up. Zeke Vance stood in the hallway. He had his hat in his hands. "Come in, Zeke," she said softly. Zeke walked in. He moved stiffly. The cold always got into his joints at night. He didn't sit down. He walked to her desk. He reached into his heavy canvas coat. He pulled out a small book. It wasn't a ledger. It was a journal, bound in cracked dark brown leather. The pages were yellowed, tied shut with a piece of rawhide. He set it gently on her desk, right next to her massive ledger. "What's this?" Eleanor asked. "My memory," Zeke said. His voice was gravel, low and quiet. "I started writing in that in 1860, long before you came. I wrote down the weather, the births, the deaths." He looked at her. His old dark eyes were dead serious. "I wrote down when Samuel died," Zeke said. "And I wrote down every day since. I wrote down how you built the north fence in the snow. I wrote down the quarantine of 75. I wrote down every time Silas came to town and took money without working for it. I wrote down the truth, Ellie, because I knew, sooner or later, a man in a suit was going to try to steal it from you." Eleanor stared at the little brown book. Her throat tightened. For 9 years, she thought she was fighting alone. She thought no one saw. No one cared. The men took their pay and went to sleep. The town took her money and looked the other way. But Zeke saw. The old vaquero had watched it all. She reached out. Her fingers traced the cracked leather of the journal. She looked up at Zeke, the old man who had spent his life invisible to the wealthy cattleman. Just another pair of hands. Zeke, Eleanor said. Her voice wavered just for a second before she found her steel. She looked him right in the eye. The society, the men who run the association, the lawyers like Silas, they might turn a blind eye to the dedication of a woman. They might turn a blind eye to a veteran ranch hand who bleeds for their dirt. They think because they own the paper, they own the truth. She picked up the small journal. She held it like it was made of gold. But they are wrong, Eleanor said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. I believe all honest labor has a soul of its own. It leaves a mark on the earth. Human dignity, Zeke. True human dignity begins when we acknowledge each other's worth, when the rest of the world turns its back. The law might not see us, but we see each other. This journal, this is the ultimate proof of our humanity. It is proof that we were here, and we mattered. Zeke stood taller. The stoop in his shoulders seemed to vanish for a moment. He nodded once, a deep, respectful bow of his head. Yes, ma'am, Zeke said softly. He turned and walked out of the room, back into the dark. Eleanor sat alone in the lamplight. She held Zeke's journal in one hand. She rested her other hand on her ledger. She wasn't just a widow fighting for a deed anymore. She was a woman holding the undeniable truth of 2 lifetimes. Let Harrison Caldwell try to fix her. Let Silas Montgomery try to evict her. She had the paper. She had the proof. And she was ready for war. The town of Cimarron was built on dust and gossip. Mostly gossip. By the time Eleanor tied her horse outside the county courthouse, half the town knew she was there. A woman riding into town alone on a Tuesday meant trouble. A widow walking into the courthouse meant war. She didn't care. She adjusted her hat, smoothed her heavy wool skirt, and walked up the wooden steps. Her boots hit the boards with a heavy, steady rhythm. Judge Thaddeus Boone's office smelled of old paper, leather, and stale pipe tobacco. Boone was 58. He had a face like a bulldog and a mind like a steel trap. He didn't suffer fools. He didn't suffer Silas Montgomery either. But Boone was a man of the system. Eleanor sat across from him. She didn't offer small talk. She laid her ledger on his desk. I need to know my ground, Thaddeus, Eleanor said. Boone leaned back. He packed his pipe slowly. He looked at her with a mixture of deep respect and genuine pity. That pity made Eleanor's jaw tighten. Your ground is shaky, Ellie, Boone said. His voice was a low rumble. You know it. Silas knows it. I built that ranch with Samuel. When the fever took him, I kept it alive. Silas didn't put a dime into the dirt. He didn't pull a single calf. He just held the paper. And the paper is all the law sees, Boone said. He struck a match, lit the pipe. The sweet smoke filled the room. Eleanor, listen to me. I need you to understand the exact legal reality you are facing. Because hope will get you killed out here. Boone leaned forward. He pointed the stem of his pipe at her. Under the laws of this territory in 1878, Boone stated clearly, a married woman's legal identity is entirely eclipsed by her husband. It is called coverture. When Samuel died, the law looked for the nearest male heir to hold the estate in trust. Silas stepped in. Unless you can produce a will explicitly naming you as the sole proprietor, or prove undeniable documented financial fraud, the court assumes Silas is protecting you. The law does not care about your sweat. The law cares about the signature. Eleanor didn't blink. She absorbed the blow. Fraud, she repeated softly. Hard proof, Ellie. Not just a feeling, not just a missing calf. Hard, undeniable paper proof. She nodded. She stood up. She picked up her ledger. Thank you, Thaddeus. Be careful, Ellie. Silas is a snake, and snakes bite when they feel cornered. Eleanor walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight. The wind had picked up. It whipped the dust down Main Street. She needed supplies. Coffee, flour, salt. She walked down the boardwalk toward Mercer's General Store. The bell above the door jingled. The store was crowded. Several ranch wives were looking at bolts of cloth. 3 men from the Cattlemen's Association stood near the Cracker Barrel, drinking cider. And there, standing by the counter, was Silas. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a bar fight. Silas turned. He wore a pristine gray suit. He smiled. It was a terrible, benevolent smile. "Eleanor," Silas said, loudly, making sure the whole room heard. "I didn't expect you in town today. Is everything all right at the house? The men aren't giving you trouble, are they?" He was playing the crowd, playing the protective, long-suffering brother-in-law. Eleanor walked to the counter. She ignored him. 10 pounds of flour, Mr. Mercer. 5 of Arbuckle's coffee." Mercer looked nervous. He glanced at Silas. He started bagging the goods. "Eleanor, dear," Silas said. He stepped closer. "People are talking. You visiting the courthouse. It looks bad. It makes it seem like you're not well, like the grief is finally catching up with you." The women near the fabric exchanged glances. The men by the barrel leaned in. "I am perfectly well, Silas," Eleanor said. She kept her voice even, ice cold. "Then let Harrison handle things," Silas urged, his voice thick with fake concern. "He's a good man. He'll take the burden off your shoulders. Samuel wouldn't want to see you like this. Bitter. Clinging to things that aren't yours." That was the line. He crossed it. Eleanor turned slowly. She looked at Silas. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The silence in the room amplified every word. "Nothing is mine, Silas?" Eleanor asked. "The herd that survived the winter. That isn't mine? The water rights I negotiated with the Cheyenne while you were hiding in Pueblo, those aren't mine? Ellie, please. You're hysterical." "I am precise," she countered, her voice slicing through his lie. "I am precise about every nail driven into the double M. I am precise about the $14,000 of profit I generated. You hold the paper, Silas. But do not ever mistake the paper for the work, and do not ever mistake my silence for surrender." She turned back to Mercer. She threw a gold coin on the counter. She picked up her heavy sacks. She walked toward the door. As she stepped out onto the boardwalk, she stopped. Standing across the street, leaning against the hitching post, was Harrison Caldwell. He had seen it all, through the large glass window of the storefront. He had seen Silas corner her. He had seen the town turn against her. Harrison was a big man, a strong man, a man hired to be the law on the double M. But he didn't cross the street. He didn't walk into the store and tell Silas to back down. He stayed right where he was, his hands jammed deep in his pockets. He needed this job. He needed the reputation. Standing up to the legal owner of a ranch to defend a widow was a good way to get blacklisted in the cattle business. So he did nothing. He chose silence. He chose cowardice. Eleanor looked at him, just for a second. There was no anger in her eyes, only a profound, heavy disappointment. It was worse than anger. She carried her sacks to her horse. She tied them down. She rode out of town. Harrison stood by the post for a long time. The dust from her horse settled in the street. But the heavy, ugly feeling in his gut wouldn't settle at all. A man can hide from a lot of things. He can hide from his past. He can hide from his mistakes. But he cannot hide from math. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about your ego. Harrison couldn't sleep. It had been 3 days since the incident in town. 3 days of watching Eleanor work the ranch with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. 3 days of feeling her disappointment like a physical weight pressing on his chest. He was the foreman, but he felt like a fraud. Silas had gone back to Pueblo for the week. The main house was quiet. At midnight, Harrison walked into the ranch office. It was Silas's domain now. The room smelled of cigar smoke and expensive brandy. Harrison carried a single lantern. He set it on the heavy mahogany desk. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew the map in his head was wrong. He needed to find the truth. He opened the drawers. Nothing but blank paper and old receipts. He checked the cabinets. Nothing. Then he noticed the floorboard beneath the desk. It wasn't completely flush. The nails were scratched, like they had been pried up recently. Harrison pulled his hunting knife from his belt. He slipped the blade under the board. He pried it up. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. It wasn't Eleanor's massive, worn ledger. This was a slim book, red leather, expensive. Harrison pulled it out. He opened it under the lantern light. It was an account book, in Silas's handwriting. Harrison traced the columns with a thick, calloused finger. He read the entries. May 1876, Denver National Bank. Withdrawal $1,200, October 1876, Pueblo Trust. Withdrawal $800, June 1877, Denver National. Withdrawal $2,800. Harrison did the math. $4,800. Bleed out of the double M over 2 years. He looked at the dates. He remembered Eleanor's ledger. He remembered the exact month she had noted sudden, unexplained drops in the capital reserves. She had written, shortfall, reason unknown. The reason wasn't unknown anymore. The reason was a thief in a tailored suit. Silas wasn't saving the ranch. He was bleeding it dry. He needed a foreman to act as a distraction, to keep Eleanor occupied while he stripped the meat off the bone. Harrison closed the red book. The leather felt hot in his hands. He had stood in town and let a thief humiliate the woman who was actually holding the sky up. He had chosen self-preservation over the truth. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the sky was the color of bruised iron. A cold drizzle fell over the basin. Harrison rode out to the eastern boundary. The fence line there was old. The cedar posts were rotting in the wet earth. He found Eleanor there. She was alone. She wore a heavy canvas slicker. She was wrestling with a pair of wire stretchers, pulling a rusted line of barbed wire taut against a new post. It was brutal, miserable work. Her hands were covered in mud. Harrison dismounted. He didn't say a word. He grabbed his thick leather gloves from his saddlebag. He walked over. He grabbed the heavy wooden handle of the stretcher. "Let me," he said. His voice was rough. Eleanor didn't argue. She stepped back. She let him take the weight. He pulled. His muscles bunched under his wet coat. The wire shrieked as it pulled tight. Eleanor stepped in quickly. She hammered a heavy steel staple into the post, pinning the wire in place. They worked like that for an hour, moving from post to post. The rain beat down on their hats. They didn't speak. The rhythm of the work was enough. Pull, hammer, move, pull, hammer, move. Finally, they reached the end of the line. Harrison leaned against the final post. He was breathing hard. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat. Eleanor wiped her muddy hands on her slicker. She looked out over the gray, rolling hills. "You stayed quiet in town," Eleanor said. She didn't look at him. She just stated a fact. Harrison looked at his boots. "I did." "Why?" "Because I am a coward," Harrison said. He didn't try to dress it up. "Because I need this job. And because my whole life I've been taught that the man with his name on the deed is the man who makes the rules. I didn't want to break the rules." Eleanor finally turned to him. The rain washed the dirt from her face. Her amber eyes were piercing. "I found Silas's second ledger," Harrison said. The words tasted like ash. "In the floorboards. $4,800. He's stealing from you. He's stealing from the ranch. You were right. About everything." He expected her to look triumphant, to gloat, to throw his cowardice back in his face. She didn't. She just looked tired. "I knew the money was gone," Eleanor said softly. "I just didn't have the proof. Without proof, Thaddeus Boone can't do a thing. Silas is a lawyer. He knows how to hide." "I have the proof now," Harrison said. "I have the book." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. "And what are you going to do with it, Harrison?" "Whatever you tell me to do." Eleanor shook her head. "No, that's not how this works. You don't hand me the gun and ask me to pull the trigger so your hands stay clean. If you want to stand on this ranch, you have to decide what kind of man you are." Harrison took a step closer. The rain fell between them. "I thought I had to come here and save you," Harrison said. "I thought you were weak because you are a woman. I was wrong." "Yes, you were." Eleanor stood her ground. She didn't back away. She looked him dead in the eye, and her voice cut through the sound of the rain. Men often divide the world into the strong and the weak, Harrison. They think strength is a loud voice or a heavy fist. But true equality isn't measured by who swings the whip the hardest. True equality is measured by who stays behind to heal the land when the drought hits. It is measured by who pulls the calf from the mud. It is measured by who does the math in the dark. Competence has no gender. You don't have to save me. I don't need a savior. I need a partner who isn't afraid of the truth. She turned. She walked back to her horse. She pulled herself into the saddle. She looked down at him one last time. Keep the ledger safe, Harrison. The storm is coming, and we are going to need it. She spurred her horse and rode off into the rain. Harrison watched her go. He reached into his coat. He felt the hard, square shape of the red leather book against his ribs. He wasn't a coward anymore. The map was rewritten. And he was ready for the storm. A liar always moves fastest when he knows the truth is catching up. Silas Montgomery didn't wait for the rain to stop. He didn't wait for the mud to dry. 3 days after Harrison found the red leather ledger beneath the floorboards, Silas made his play. He didn't do it at the ranch. He did it in town, where he had the audience, where he had the power. It was a Thursday afternoon. The Cattlemen's Association had called an emergency session. The telegraph wires had been buzzing all morning. Men rode in from the outlying spreads, their horses kicking up thick, wet clods of earth on Main Street. Eleanor wasn't invited. Silas made sure of that, but Harrison was. Harrison stood in the back of the town hall. His boots were caked with mud. His heavy canvas coat dripped onto the floorboards. He watched Silas stand at the front of the room, looking like a king addressing his court. "Gentlemen," Silas began. His voice was somber, heavy with rehearsed sorrow. "I called you here today to speak of a family tragedy, and a danger to this entire valley." The room went quiet. Men leaned forward on their wooden benches. "The Double M is the anchor of the Cimarron Basin," Silas said. "My brother Samuel built it to last. But since his passing, the foundation has cracked. I have tried to protect my sister-in-law. I have given her time to grieve. I have given her grace. But her grief has turned to madness." Harrison's jaw tightened. He felt the heavy square of the red ledger pressing against his ribs, hidden deep inside his coat. "She is making erratic decisions," Silas lied smoothly. "She is alienating our hands. She is endangering the herd. Just last week, she nearly compromised our water reserves in a dispute with Josiah Blackwood." A murmur went through the crowd. Water was the only thing these men cared about more than beef. "Therefore," Silas said, raising a hand to quiet them, "for the good of the ranch and the good of this association, I have filed a formal injunction. Judge Boone signed it this morning. Eleanor has 30 days to vacate the main house. She will be relocated to a modest property in town. The Double M will be brought under the absolute direct control of myself and my new foreman, Harrison Caldwell." The men nodded. It sounded reasonable. It sounded safe. They didn't want a crazy widow threatening their water supply. The meeting adjourned. Men slapped Silas on the back. They offered their condolences. Harrison didn't move. He waited by the door until the hall cleared out. Silas walked down the center aisle. He looked smug, triumphant. He stopped when he saw Harrison blocking the exit. "Harrison, my boy," Silas said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. "Perfect timing. I need your signature." "On what?" Harrison asked. His voice was a low rumble. "An affidavit," Silas said casually. "Just a formality for the court. It confirms your professional assessment. That Eleanor is incompetent, that the ranch is failing under her care, that she needs to be removed for the safety of the herd." Harrison looked at the paper. Then he looked at Silas. "Sign it," Silas said. His smile dropped a fraction, the underlying threat bleeding through. "You sign this and your pay doubles. You get a 10% stake in the spring calf crop. You'll be a rich man, Harrison. You'll be the king of the Cimarron." Harrison didn't reach for the paper. He didn't blink. "I won't sign it," Harrison said. Silas froze. The silence in the empty hall was sudden and absolute. "Excuse me?" Silas asked. "I said no," Harrison repeated. His voice was perfectly steady. "I won't put my name to a lie. The ranch isn't failing. She isn't mad. You're stealing it from her." Silas's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "You are a hired hand, Caldwell. You work for me. You do what I tell you to do." "I work for the double M," Harrison corrected him. "And the double M is Eleanor Montgomery." "She's a woman with nothing," Silas hissed. He stepped closer, the veneer of the cultured lawyer completely gone. "I have the deed. I have the judge. I have the entire town. If you don't sign this paper, I will ruin you. You will never work a ranch west of the Mississippi again. I will make sure your name is dirt." Harrison looked down at the smaller man. He felt a profound sense of calm wash over him. The map was finally right. He knew exactly where he stood. "You do what you have to do, Silas," Harrison said. "But my name belongs to me, and I'm not selling it to a thief." Harrison turned his back on Silas Montgomery. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked out into the cold air. He had to find Eleanor. He had to tell her the storm had broken. He found her at the ranch 2 hours later. She was in the barn graining the horses. He told her everything: the meeting, the eviction notice, the affidavit. Eleanor didn't drop the grain bucket. She didn't cry. She just finished pouring the oats into the trough. She watched the horse eat for a long moment. 30 days, she said quietly. "He's moving fast," Harrison said. "He knows Boone won't throw you out without a hearing. He's trying to establish a narrative. Make the town think you're a danger before we even get into the courtroom." Eleanor turned around. She wiped her hands on her apron. "He thinks he has the water," she said. Harrison frowned. "What?" "Silas told the association I was a threat to the water," Eleanor explained. Her mind was already racing ahead, working the problem. "He's relying on the treaty I made with Josiah Blackwood to keep the Double M's pastures green. If Silas takes over, he thinks that treaty transfers to him along with the deed." "Doesn't it?" Harrison asked. "No," Eleanor said. A fierce, sharp light ignited in her amber eyes. "Because Josiah Blackwood doesn't make treaties with pieces of paper. He makes treaties with people." She walked past Harrison. She grabbed her heavy riding coat from the hook. She threw it over her shoulders. She grabbed her saddle. "Where are you going?" Harrison asked. "To the Blackwood spread," Eleanor said. She hauled the saddle onto her bay gelding. "I need a witness. I need the biggest, meanest man in this valley to walk into Thaddeus Boone's office and tell Silas Montgomery he owns nothing." "I'm coming with you," Harrison said. "No." Eleanor tightened the cinch. She looked at him over the horse's back. "Josiah respects strength. He respects independence. If I ride in there with a man guarding my back, he'll think I'm weak. I have to do this alone." Harrison didn't like it, but he knew she was right. "Be careful," Harrison said. "Always," she replied. She rode out. The sky was darkening again. The wind was picking up. The Blackwood spread was 10 miles east. It was rugged country, deep ravines, scrub oak, the kind of land that broke weak horses and weak people. Eleanor rode hard. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the fatigue. She only felt the ticking clock. Josiah Blackwood's house wasn't a grand timber mansion like hers. It was a fortress of stone and heavy logs, built right against the side of a mountain. Smoke plumed from the stone chimney. As she rode into the yard, 3 massive hunting dogs ran out, barking fiercely. Eleanor didn't flinch. She kept her horse steady. She waited. The heavy oak door opened. Josiah Blackwood stepped out onto the porch. He was a mountain of a man, a thick gray beard, shoulders like a draft horse. He held a lever-action rifle casually in one hand. He saw who it was. He lowered the rifle. He snapped his fingers, and the dogs went quiet. "Eleanor," Blackwood said. His deep voice carried over the wind. "Bit late for a social call." "I didn't come to socialize, Josiah," Eleanor said. She stayed in the saddle. She looked down at him. Blackwood chuckled. "You never do. Come on inside. Get out of the wind." She dismounted and tied her horse. She followed him into the great room. It was warm. The fire roared in the hearth. Blackwood poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed her one. She took it, but she didn't drink. "Silas served me with an eviction notice today," Eleanor said. She didn't waste time. "He's taking the double M. He told the Cattlemen's Association he has the operation under control. He told them your water is secure." Blackwood took a slow sip of his whiskey. His eyes narrowed beneath his thick brows. "Is that so?" "He holds the deed, Josiah. The law says he owns the dirt." "The law says a lot of things," Blackwood grumbled. He walked over to the fire and stared into the flames. "Silas is a fool, but he's a fool with a judge in his pocket." "I have a hearing with Judge Boone in 3 days," Eleanor said. "I need you there." Blackwood turned his head. He looked at her. "To do what?" "To tell the truth about the water." Eleanor set her glass of whiskey down on the heavy wooden table. She stepped closer to the giant man. "Josiah, you and I made a deal," she said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic, demanding his full attention. "When the drought hit in 72, I didn't send a lawyer to your door. I rode here myself. I stood in this room. We looked each other in the eye, and we shook hands. You gave me access to the upper aquifer, and I pulled my fences back to give your southern herd the creek. That was the deal." "It was a good deal," Blackwood agreed softly. "Saved us both." "But Silas wasn't in the room," Eleanor continued. "Silas doesn't know the capacity of those wells. If he takes my ranch, he will drain your aquifer dry in a month just to prove he can. He doesn't respect the land, he only respects the profit." Blackwood's jaw set hard. He knew it was true. "I need you in that courtroom," Eleanor said. She looked at him, not asking for a favor, demanding a standard. "This isn't just about my ranch, Josiah," Eleanor said, ensuring the weight of the lesson landed squarely in the room. "Survival out here isn't based on paper deeds. It's based on mutual trust. It's based on honoring on mutual trust. It's based on honoring the word you give to your neighbor. A society that lets a thief steal the harvest of an honest worker is a society that will eventually starve. If you let Silas Montgomery break me using the law will eventually come for you. True security isn't isolation. It's standing up for the people who actually bleed for this dirt." Blackwood was quiet. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside the thick stone walls. He looked at the woman standing in his hall, small, battered by the weather, but harder than the stone he built his house from. He set his whiskey glass down. 3 days, Blackwood said. "Friday morning, 9 o'clock, Eleanor confirmed. Blackwood nodded his massive head. "I'll be there, Ellie. You have my word." Eleanor let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 9 years. She nodded. She turned and walked back out into the cold. She had her witness. She had her foreman. She had her ledger. The storm had arrived, and she was riding right into the center of it. Friday morning. The air in Cimarron was brittle and cold. The county courthouse was a 2-story brick building at the end of Main Street. It usually smelled of pine polish and boredom. Today, it smelled of sweat and anticipation. Word had spread. Josiah Blackwood had ridden into town at dawn with 4 of his roughest hands. Harrison Caldwell had been seen drinking black coffee on the boardwalk, looking like a man preparing for a gunfight. And Silas Montgomery had walked into the courthouse flanked by 2 junior lawyers from Pueblo. The town knew something was about to break. Judge Thaddeus Boone's chambers were on the 2nd floor. It was a large room lined with law books bound in cracked leather. A heavy oak desk sat at the far end. At 9 o'clock, the doors closed. Inside the room sat Judge Boone, Silas Montgomery, his 2 lawyers, Eleanor, Harrison Caldwell, Zeke Vance, and taking up an entire corner of the room, Josiah Blackwood. Boone banged his wooden gavel once against a leather block. "This is a preliminary hearing," Boone announced. His bulldog face was grim. "Silas Montgomery has filed for an immediate writ of possession and the physical eviction of Eleanor Montgomery from the Double M Ranch. Silas, you have the floor." Silas stood up. He buttoned his expensive jacket. He looked completely at ease. "Thank you, Your Honor," Silas said smoothly. "This is a simple matter of property law and protective custody. Under the laws of coverture in this territory, upon my brother's tragic death, the estate fell to me as the nearest male relative. I hold the deed, I hold the title. It is my legal duty to manage the property." Silas paced slowly across the floor. He didn't look at Eleanor. "For years I allowed my sister-in-law to reside in the main house out of pity," Silas continued. "But her grief has compromised her judgment. She is alienating the men. The ranch is losing money. She is a danger to herself and the financial security of the estate. I ask the court to enforce my legal rights, remove her from the property, and allow me to save my brother's legacy." Silas sat down. He looked immensely pleased with himself. Judge Boone looked over his glasses at Eleanor. "Mrs. Montgomery," Boone said, "the law is clear regarding the deed. Do you have any evidence to present that would delay this eviction?" Eleanor stood up. She didn't pace. She stood perfectly still. She reached into her canvas bag. She pulled out her massive, cracked leather ledger. She walked to the judge's desk and set it down. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Your Honor," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm, resonant. "That book contains 9 years of daily records. It proves that I have managed every penny, every calf, and every wage on the Double M. It proves a net profit of $14,000. The ranch is not failing. It is thriving because of me." Silas snorted. "A woman's diary proves nothing. Anyone can write numbers on a page." Eleanor ignored him. She looked at the back of the room. "Mr. Vance," she said. Zeke stood up. He took off his battered hat. He walked forward slowly. He pulled his small brown leather journal from his coat. He set it on the judge's desk, right next to Eleanor's massive ledger. "I've worked the Cimarron since '55, Judge," Zeke said. His gravelly voice filled the quiet room. "I wrote down every day of it. I wrote down who bought the seed, who paid the hands, who stayed up 4 nights straight during the fever of '75 to keep the herd alive. It was Eleanor. Silas Montgomery ain't spent a single night freezing in the mud for that ranch. This book is my sworn testimony." Boone looked at the old worn journal. He knew Zeke Vance. The man didn't lie. Silas's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Silas waved a hand dismissively. "The sentimental ramblings of an old cowhand. It doesn't change the law of the deed, Your Honor." "Perhaps," Boone said. He looked at Eleanor. "What else, Ellie?" "Josiah Blackwood," Eleanor said. The mountain of a man pushed off the wall. He didn't walk to the desk, he just spoke from where he stood. His voice shook the glass in the windows. "Silas Montgomery thinks he owns the water," Blackwood rumbled. "He told the Cattlemen's Association he has it secured. He is a liar." Silas jumped to his feet. "I object. This is outrageous." "Sit down, Silas," Boone snapped. He pointed his gavel at Blackwood. "Continue, Josiah." "The water treaty that keeps the Double M and the Eastern Basin alive was forged between me and Eleanor," Blackwood said. "We shook on it. I don't honor paper. I honor the person. If you hand that ranch to Silas, Judge, I dam the creek. I close the sluice. I will let his pastures turn to dust. My treaty is with the woman who built the ranch. Period." The room was dead silent. A ranch without water was just a graveyard for cows. Silas's entire claim of financial security was crumbling. Silas was sweating now. He wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "Your Honor," Silas stammered, "this is extortion. The deed is the only thing that matters. I am the legal owner. I am protecting the assets." "Are you?" The voice came from the back. Harrison Caldwell stepped forward. Silas looked at him, his eyes wide. "Harrison, tell them. Tell the judge what a mess the ranch is." Harrison didn't look at Silas. He walked straight to the judge's desk. He reached inside his heavy canvas coat. He pulled out the red leather book. He placed it gently on top of Eleanor's ledger. "I was hired to find the rot on the double M," Harrison said. His voice was steady. "I found it, but it wasn't the widow." Boone leaned forward. He looked at the red book. "What is this, Mr. Caldwell?" "That is a private accounting ledger," Harrison said. "I found it hidden under the floorboards of the ranch office, written in Silas Montgomery's hand. It details systematic withdrawals from the Double M Capital Reserves into private bank accounts in Denver and Pueblo over the last 2 years, exactly $4,800. Silas let out a strangled gasp. He grabbed the edge of his table. The color drained completely from his face. "It's a forgery!" Silas shrieked. "He stole it! He's lying!" "The handwriting matches the deed," Harrison said calmly. "The bank records will match the dates. He isn't protecting the estate, Judge. He's embezzling from it." Judge Thaddeus Boone slowly opened the red book. He ran his finger down the columns. His jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. He looked up at Silas. The pity was gone, replaced by absolute disgust. "Fraud," Boone whispered. The magic word. The only word that could break the iron chain of coverture law. Eleanor stepped forward. She didn't look at Silas. She didn't look at Harrison. She looked directly at Judge Thaddeus Boone. This was the moment. The culmination of 9 years of silence, 9 years of swallowing her pride. She stood tall. Her voice rang out, clear and piercing, filling every corner of the room. "Your Honor," Eleanor began. Every man in the room stopped breathing. "The laws of 1878 were written by men, designed to protect the property of men," Eleanor stated. The words were a hammer striking an anvil. "They assume that a woman is merely an extension of her husband, a dependent, a shadow." She pointed a scarred, calloused finger at the pile of ledgers on the desk. "But a civilized society cannot tolerate the theft of a marginalized person's labor under the guise of legal protection. Human rights are not a privilege handed down in a will. They are not granted by a signature on a piece of paper." She stepped closer to the bench. Her amber eyes burned with the fire of 1,000 freezing nights in the mud. "Human rights are forged in sweat, blood, and actual sacrifice," Eleanor declared. "I did not inherit that ranch. I bled for it. I starved for it. I fought the earth and the sky to keep it alive. If you strip me of this ranch today, relying on an archaic law while ignoring the undeniable proof of my labor and his theft, you do not just take my property." She took a deep breath. "You strip away my fundamental right to exist as an independent human being. You declare that my life, my mind, and my work have no value. I demand the right to own what I have built." The echo of her words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Judge Boone sat in silence for a long, terrible minute. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the men who had come to stand behind her. And he looked at Eleanor Montgomery. He picked up his wooden gavel. He didn't tap it. He slammed it down with the force of a thunderclap. "The petition for eviction is denied," Boone roared. "Silas Montgomery, you are hereby stripped of all fiduciary control over the Double M estate pending a full criminal investigation into these financial records. You are forbidden to set foot on the property." Boone looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Montgomery," the judge said softly, "the ranch is yours. Keep it safe." Silas collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His lawyers backed away from him like he had the plague. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply reached out, picked up her heavy ledger, and tucked it under her arm. She turned and walked down the center aisle. Josiah Blackwood tipped his hat to her. Zeke Vance smiled a tight, proud smile. And Harrison Caldwell followed her out the door. Out of the suffocating room and back into the cold, clean air of the territory, she had finally won. The storm was over. The dust settled. Saturday morning on the Double M broke clear and cold. The sky was a pale, hard blue. It was the kind of morning that made a person feel small. Eleanor stood on the front porch. She held a cup of black coffee. She looked out over the yard. It was hers, all of it. The law finally agreed with the calluses on her hands. But winning a war doesn't mean the ground isn't scorched. Silas was gone. The threat was removed. Yet the silence left behind felt heavy. A ranch this size didn't run on victory. It ran on labor. It ran on trust. She heard the sound of hooves before she saw the horse. A rider came up the long dirt drive. It was Harrison Caldwell. He rode his big dun gelding. He had left for Denver immediately after the hearing on Friday. He rode through the night to get back. He rode into the yard. He dismounted. He tied his horse to the rail. He looked exhausted. His clothes were covered in road dust. His eyes were lined with fatigue. He reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. He walked up the wooden steps to the porch. He stopped a few feet from her. He took off his hat. "Morning," Harrison said. His voice was a low rasp. "Morning," Eleanor replied. She didn't offer him coffee. She didn't invite him inside. She waited. Harrison looked at the envelope in his hands. Then he looked at her. "I went to Denver," Harrison said. "I saw a lawyer, a good one. Not the kind Silas uses." He held the envelope out. Eleanor didn't take it. "What is it?" "It's a contract," Harrison said. "An equitable partnership agreement. It legally binds my labor to your capital. It splits the operational control down the middle. It gives you veto power over any sale, any hire, and any expansion. It protects you from me, and it protects you from anyone who comes after me." Eleanor looked at the thick yellow paper. A week ago, she would have killed for a document like that. A week ago, it would have been a lifeline. Today, it was a choice. "I own the double M," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, calm. "Thaddeus Boone made that clear. Silas is out. The bank knows it. The association knows it. I can hire any foreman I want. I can pay them a flat wage. I don't need a partner, Harrison. I can do this alone. I have done this alone." "I know," Harrison said. He didn't flinch. "You don't need me. That's why I had it drawn up. Because I want to be here. And I want you to know I'm not trying to take what's yours." Eleanor finally reached out. She took the envelope. She didn't open it, she just held it. "You stood up in that courtroom," Eleanor said. "You handed over the red ledger. You gave me the bullet I needed to shoot Silas down. I'm grateful for that." She stepped closer to him. The morning wind whipped the hem of her heavy skirt. "But you also stood on the boardwalk outside Mercer's store," Eleanor said. The words were quiet, but they cut like a straight razor. "You watched Silas humiliate me in front of half the town. You watched them look at me like I was a hysterical, grieving fool. And you put your hands in your pockets. You chose your reputation over the truth." Harrison looked down at his boots. The shame was there, plain and ugly. "I did," he admitted. "So a piece of paper from a Denver lawyer doesn't fix that," Eleanor said. "A contract doesn't buy back the respect Silas stripped from me in that store, not in this town." Harrison looked up, his jaw tightened. Not with anger, with resolve. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Eleanor looked him dead in the eye. "I want you to go back into town," she said. "I want you to walk into Mercer's store. I want you to walk into the Cattlemen's Association. And I want you to tell every man who heard Silas Montgomery's lies exactly what you saw. I want you to tell them about the red ledger. I want you to tell them how wrong you were. You're going to use your voice and your reputation as a Wyoming foreman to clear my name, publicly." It was a massive demand. In 1878, a man's pride was his currency. For a respected foreman to walk into a room full of cattlemen and admit he was played for a fool, to admit he was wrong, and to publicly defend a woman he had previously doubted. It was professional suicide. Men would laugh. They would question his grit. They would call him soft. Harrison knew exactly what it would cost him. He didn't hesitate. He didn't bargain. "I'll saddle a fresh horse," Harrison said. He turned to walk back down the steps. "Why?" Eleanor's voice stopped him. He turned back around. She was watching him carefully, studying him. "Why are you so willing to do this?" she asked. "You could ride away right now. You could go back to Wyoming. Your reputation would stay intact. Why stay here and burn it down for me?" Harrison looked at her. He thought about the red ledger. He thought about the wire they stretched in the freezing rain. He thought about the way she looked at Judge Boone, demanding her right to exist. He took a step back toward her. "Eleanor," Harrison said, his voice deep and entirely steady. "I spent my whole life thinking that saving people meant doing the work for them. I thought being a man meant taking the reins when a woman looked tired. I thought that was what made me strong." He took a breath. The cold air filled his lungs. "But you taught me something else," Harrison said. He looked right into her amber eyes. The words were deliberate, carefully chosen. He needed her to understand. "Real healing doesn't come from someone throwing you a lifeline when you're drowning. It doesn't come from someone taking your heavy load and telling you to go rest. Real healing comes from someone brave enough to stand up and testify to your truth, even when it costs them their own pride. True accountability isn't just fixing the fence, it's standing in front of the town and admitting you were the one who let the wolves in." Eleanor stayed perfectly still. "I am deeply sorry for compromising with a lie," Harrison told her. "I am sorry I let my ego keep me quiet on that boardwalk. But from this day forward, the truth is the only foundation between us. I am going into town because an apology without action is just a lie you tell to yourself." The silence on the porch stretched out. It wasn't a heavy silence anymore. It was clear, like the sky above them. Eleanor looked at the man standing before her. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a knight. He was just a man, flawed, stubborn. But he was willing to break his own pride over his knee to build something real. She looked down at the manila envelope in her hands. "The north pasture fence needs mending," Eleanor said. Harrison blinked. "What?" "Zeke said the cattle are pushing against the rotting wood near the creek," Eleanor said. Her tone was back to business, flat, practical. "It's a two-person job. The ground is still frozen underneath. We'll need the heavy post hole diggers." Harrison let out a slow breath. A small, genuine smile cracked the hard lines of his face. "I'll go to town first," Harrison said. "I'll talk to Mercer. I'll talk to the association. I'll get the post hole diggers while I'm there." "See that you do," Eleanor said. She turned and walked to the front door. She opened it. She stopped. She looked back over her shoulder. "Harrison." He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Yeah?" "When you get back," Eleanor said, "I'll have coffee waiting. We have a lot of work to do." She went inside. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Harrison stood in the yard. The wind whipped past him. He felt lighter than he had in 10 years. He walked to the barn. He saddled a fresh horse. He rode out toward Cimarron. He was riding into a storm of gossip, ridicule, and bruised male egos. But for the first time in his life, he was holding the right map. Spring finally broke across the Colorado Territory. The snowmelt rushed down from the high peaks, filling the creeks with cold, white-capped water. The grass in the lower basin turned a violent, beautiful green. The Double M Ranch breathed again. It had been 4 weeks since the hearing in Judge Boone's chambers. The official decree arrived by registered mail on a Tuesday. It carried the heavy wax seal of the territorial court. It was absolute. Silas Montgomery was permanently stripped of all legal claims to the property. He had fled to Denver to avoid the embezzlement charges. He was a ghost. Eleanor owned the deed, in her own name. The town of Cimarron treated her differently now. When she walked into Mercer's store, the men didn't whisper. They nodded. They tipped their hats, not out of pity, out of a healthy, terrified respect. Harrison had done what he promised. He had walked into the store. He had walked into the association. He told them the truth. He took their sneers, he took their jokes. He didn't throw a single punch. He just let the truth stand there, naked and heavy, until they had to look at it. The dust had settled. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Surviving a war is one thing. Making sure the next generation doesn't have to fight it is another. On a bright Thursday afternoon, Eleanor sat at the massive oak dining table in the main house. The windows were open, letting in the smell of pine and damp earth. Sitting across from her was Abigail Preston. Abby looked nervous. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. Her husband was out with the herd, and she had ridden over the ridge just to sit in Eleanor's kitchen. Eleanor didn't offer her tea. She offered her something better. She reached under the table. She pulled out a brand-new blank ledger. The leather cover was stiff. The pages were crisp and white. She set it on the table and pushed it across to Abby. Next to it, she placed a glass inkwell and a steel-nibbed pen. Abby stared at the tools, like they were loaded guns. "What is this, Ellie?" Abby asked softly. "That is your voice," Eleanor said. Abby looked up, confused. "My voice?" Eleanor leaned forward. She rested her forearms on the solid oak table. "Abby, your husband is a good man," Eleanor started. "But out here, good men die. Horses kick, fever spreads, winters freeze. If something happens to him, what happens to you?" Abby swallowed hard. The ranch belongs to his father in Ohio. We just run it." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "You run it. You cook the meals. You mend the clothes. You help with the calving. You scrub the floors. You pour your life into that dirt. But if your husband dies tomorrow, his father in Ohio can sell that land out from under you, and you leave with nothing but the clothes on your back." Abby's eyes welled with tears. It was the terrifying reality every woman on the frontier lived with, but no one ever spoke aloud. Eleanor tapped the blank ledger. "This stops that," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't comforting. It was commanding. It was the voice of a general arming a soldier. "Abigail, you must listen to me," Eleanor stated, ensuring every word landed with the weight of law. "Paper and ink are the only legal weapons of self-defense women have in this era. A court of law will not care about your tears. A judge will not care about the hours you spent sweating in the sun. They care about numbers. They care about dates. They care about documentation." Abby reached out hesitantly. Her fingers brushed the stiff leather cover. "You open this book today," Eleanor instructed. "You write down every dollar spent. You write down every calf sold. You document every hour of labor you contribute to the financial survival of that property. You create an undeniable mathematical record of your existence. Because if the day comes when a man tries to erase you, this ink is the only thing that will prove you were ever there." Abby looked at the pen. She picked it up. It looked strange in her hand. Usually her hands held a wooden spoon or a sewing needle. The steel pen felt sharp, dangerous. "Dip it," Eleanor said. Abby dipped the pen in the inkwell. She opened the ledger to the first blank page. "Write the date," Eleanor said. "And write your name. Not your husband's name. Yours." Abby's hand shook slightly, but she pressed the steel nib to the paper. The black ink flowed onto the white page. "Abigail Rose Preston, May 14th, 1878. Abby looked at her name, written in dark, permanent ink. She let out a breath. Her shoulders relaxed. She looked up at Eleanor. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, dawning power. "I'll show you how to draw the columns," Eleanor said gently. "We'll start with the grocery accounts. Then we'll move to the feed." They spent the next 2 hours working, not ranch work, future work. That evening, the ranch was quiet. Harrison and the hands were down at the bunkhouse. The cattle were bedded down in the lower pastures. Eleanor sat in the study. She was updating her own massive ledger, the one that had saved her life. There was a soft knock at the open door. It was Zeke Vance. He had his hat in his hands. He looked uncomfortable standing in the grand study. He was a man of the barn, of the open sky. "Come in, Zeke," Eleanor said. She closed her book. Zeke walked in slowly. He stood by the desk. He reached into his coat. He didn't pull out his brown leather journal this time. He pulled out a folded piece of plain paper. "Ellie," Zeke said. His gravel voice was rougher than usual. "I was wondering if you had a minute." "Always, Zeke. What do you need?" He held the paper out. "I want to send a letter to my boy down in Chihuahua. He's grown now, probably got kids of his own." Eleanor took the paper. It was blank. "I ain't wrote to him in 15 years, Zeke confessed. He looked out the dark window. He couldn't meet her eyes. Didn't have nothing good to say. Just a tired old man working another man's dirt. Didn't want him to know I was just nobody." Eleanor felt a tightness in her throat. She understood, more than anyone. "You aren't nobody, Zeke," Eleanor said softly. "You're the man who remembered." "Well," Zeke said. He cleared his throat. "Things changed. Silas is gone. The ranch is solid. I feel right staying here. So I want to tell him where his old man ended up." He looked back at her. The shame was gone, replaced by a quiet pride. "But my hands," Zeke said, holding up his thick, scarred, arthritic fingers. "They don't hold a pen so good no more. They just shake. I was wondering if you could write it down for me. If I talk." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just pulled a fresh piece of paper toward her. She dipped her pen in the ink. "Pull up a chair, Zeke," she said. Zeke pulled a heavy wooden chair to the desk. He sat down. He took a deep breath. "Dear Mateo," Zeke started. His voice was soft in the quiet room. "I hope this letter finds you well. I hope the sun is shining down your way." Eleanor's pen scratched across the paper, fast, fluid. She wrote down his words. She wrote down his history. She wrote down the pride of a man who had finally seen the truth win. They worked for an hour, the old vaquero and the widow, two people who the world had tried to make invisible, sitting in the lamplight, making sure the world knew exactly who they were. When it was done, Eleanor folded the paper. She dripped a drop of hot red wax onto the flap. She pressed it flat. She handed the sealed letter to Zeke. "I'll take it to the postmaster tomorrow," Eleanor said. Zeke took the letter. He held it in both hands. He looked at it for a long time. "Thank you, Ellie," he whispered. He stood up. He put his hat back on. He walked out of the room, stepping lighter than he had in years. Eleanor sat alone in the study. She looked at her inkwell. She looked at her ledger. The wounds were still there. The scars would never fade. Silas had taken years from her life. The town had doubted her. Harrison had hesitated. But scars didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was what you built after the bleeding stopped. What mattered was the ink on the page, the truth in the books, the letters sent home. She wiped the nib of her pen clean. She turned down the kerosene lamp. The work was done for today, and tomorrow she would wake up and do it all again. Because this was her dirt, her sky, her ranch, and nobody would ever try to take it away again. August came in hot, the kind of hot that bakes the earth until it cracks. The tall grass in the Cimarron Basin turned a deep burnt gold. The creeks ran shallow. The air shimmered above the dirt roads, thick and heavy with the smell of pine resin and dust. Eleanor Montgomery stood on the front porch of the Double M. She held a piece of heavy parchment in her hand. It wasn't a ledger. It wasn't an eviction notice. It was a deed of sale. Her lawyer in Denver had worked fast. With the embezzlement charges hanging over his head, Silas had folded. He didn't fight. He took a minimal buyout, funded entirely by the cash reserves Eleanor had built herself. He signed away his claim, his title, and his connection to the Montgomery name. The paper in her hand was the final proof. She owned the Double M Ranch, 100%. There was no male relative holding it in trust. There was no brother-in-law pulling the strings from Pueblo. There was just Eleanor, a sovereign entity in a territory run by men. She folded the parchment. She put it in her apron pocket. She looked out over the yard. The ranch was running like a Swiss watch. The hands were moving cattle to the higher, cooler pastures. The winter feed was already being baled and stacked. The fences were tight. She didn't need a foreman anymore. She knew the operation better than anyone. She could hire a dozen men to do the heavy lifting, pay them a flat wage, and run the empire from her desk. She didn't need Harrison Caldwell. But needing someone and wanting them are two very different things. She stepped off the porch. Her boots crunched against the dry earth. She walked toward the main barn. It was cooler inside. The air smelled of sweet oats, old leather, and horse sweat. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the high windows. Harrison was there. He was at the far end of the barn. He had his heavy leather apron on. He was standing over the glowing coals of the small forge, heating a piece of iron to shape a new hinge for the corral gate. He swung the heavy hammer. The metal rang out, a sharp, rhythmic sound. Sparks flew, dying quickly in the dirt. He was focused, sweating, doing the work. Eleanor walked down the center aisle. She stopped a few feet away. She didn't say anything. She just watched him. Harrison felt her presence before he saw her. He stopped hammering. He lowered the iron back into the coals. He wiped his brow with the back of his thick forearm. He turned to look at her. "Hinge snapped on the south gate," Harrison said. His voice was rough, dry from the heat. "Figured I'd forge a heavier one. Those bulls are getting restless with the heat." "They usually do in August," Eleanor said. Harrison took off his heavy leather gloves. He tossed them onto the anvil. He looked at her. He could read the shift in her posture. "You got the paper," Harrison said. It wasn't a question. "I got the paper," Eleanor confirmed. She pulled the folded parchment from her pocket. She held it up. "Silas is bought out. The bank cleared the transfer this morning. The double M is mine." Harrison nodded. He didn't smile. He just looked at the paper. "Congratulations, Eleanor," Harrison said quietly. "You earned every inch of it." "Yes, I did." She put the paper back in her pocket. She took a step closer to the forge. The heat from the coals washed over her face. "Which means," Eleanor said, her voice perfectly level, "I don't need a foreman to act as a buffer between me and the Cattlemen's Association. I don't need a man to legitimize my operation. I can run this place alone. I have done it before. I can do it for the next 20 years. Harrison looked at her. He didn't flinch. His jaw tightened just a fraction, but he held his ground. He thought she was firing him. He thought this was the end of the road. "I'll pack my gear," Harrison said. His voice was heavy, resigned. "I can be off the property by noon. You won't owe me for the week." He turned to pick up his gloves. "Harrison." He stopped. Her voice was sharp. It cracked like a whip in the quiet barn. He turned back around. "Did I ask you to pack?" Eleanor asked. Harrison frowned. Confusion flickered in his dark eyes. "You just said you didn't need me." "I don't," Eleanor said. She closed the distance between them. She stood right in front of him. She looked up. Her amber eyes were fierce, piercing. They demanded everything from him. "I need you to listen to me right now," Eleanor said. Her words were measured, rhythmic, spoken with absolute clarity. "I need you to understand exactly what this is and what it isn't." Harrison stood perfectly still. He listened. "Men write stories about saving women," Eleanor said. Her voice rang out in the quiet barn, stating the truth she had bled for. "They sing songs about pulling us from the fire. They build this whole world on the idea that a woman is a fragile thing waiting for a strong hand. But true partnership isn't a rescue, Harrison." She pointed a calloused finger at his chest. "True love and true partnership are not built on necessity. They are built on choice. A woman shouldn't have to be helpless to be loved. And a man shouldn't have to play the savior to feel valuable. I don't need you to survive. I survived before you got here. I will survive long after." But I am choosing you. I am choosing you because you saw the dirt on my hands, you saw the ledger on my desk, and you learned to respect my mind as much as your own." She let the words hang in the air, let the weight of them settle onto his shoulders. "I don't want a foreman," Eleanor said softly. "I want a partner, an equal split, on paper and in the dirt." Harrison stared at her. He had spent his whole life breaking horses, pushing cows, fighting men. He had never heard anyone speak like this. He had never been offered something so clean, so terrifyingly real. She wasn't asking him to take care of her. She was asking him to stand beside her. He didn't answer right away. He reached into the inner pocket of his canvas vest. He pulled out a sealed envelope. It was worn at the edges. He had been carrying it for days. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Eleanor asked. "It's a letter," Harrison said. His voice was thick with emotion. "Addressed to the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association, to the 3 biggest ranchers in Laramie, the men who trained me, the men who give me my reputation." Eleanor looked at the envelope. "What does it say?" "It tells them the truth," Harrison said. He didn't look away from her. "It tells them I came down to Colorado and judged a ranch by the gender of its owner. It tells them I was a blind, arrogant fool. It tells them I almost helped a thief steal an empire because I thought a woman couldn't run a ledger." Eleanor's breath hitched, just slightly. In their world, reputation was a man's lifeblood. A foreman admitting absolute incompetence to the men who made him. It was professional suicide. It was the burning of his ships. "You wrote this," Eleanor said quietly, "before I bought Silas out, before you knew if I would keep you on." "I wrote it 3 days ago," Harrison said, "because whether you kept me or fired me, I couldn't carry that pride anymore. You told me an apology without action is just a lie, so I put it in ink." He looked at the letter in her hand. "You said true partnership is built on choice," Harrison said. He took a step closer. The heat of the forge was nothing compared to the heat between them. "I choose to burn my old map. I choose to stand on this dirt. I choose you, Eleanor, as my partner, as my equal, if you'll still have me." Eleanor looked at the letter. She looked at the man. He wasn't perfect. He had stumbled. He had failed. But he had bled his own ego dry to make it right. "I'll have you," Eleanor said. She didn't throw her arms around him. She didn't weep. She just reached out and took his thick, calloused hand in hers. She gripped it hard, a handshake between titans. "Now," Eleanor said, her voice dropping back to its practical rhythm, "we have an appointment in town." At 2 o'clock, the sun was at its highest point. Judge Thaddeus Boone sat behind his heavy oak desk in the county courthouse. The windows were open, trying to catch a breeze that didn't exist. He wiped his face with a handkerchief. The heavy wooden doors opened. Eleanor and Harrison walked in. They didn't look like a couple coming to court for a marriage license. They looked like 2 generals coming to sign a treaty. They wore their work clothes, boots dusty, faces tanned and lined by the wind. Zeke Vance walked in behind them. He took his hat off and stood by the door, a silent sentinel. "Eleanor," Judge Boone said. He sat up straighter. "Harrison, what can I do for you?" Eleanor walked to the desk. She placed a document on the polished wood. It was the equitable partnership agreement Harrison had drawn up in Denver. "We need you to witness and file this, Thaddeus," Eleanor said. Boone picked up his reading glasses. He slipped them onto his nose. He scanned the document. His eyebrows rose higher and higher with every paragraph he read. He looked over his glasses at Harrison. "Caldwell," Boone said, his voice full of disbelief. "Did you actually read this before you brought it here?" "I had it drafted, Judge," Harrison said. "This agreement gives Eleanor absolute veto power over any financial decision you make," Boone pointed out. "It ties your labor to her capital, but prevents you from leveraging the property without her signature. In the eyes of the territory, it essentially neuters your legal authority as a male partner." "I am aware of the terms, Your Honor," Harrison said. His voice was rock solid. Boone shook his head. He looked at Eleanor. A genuine smile broke across his bulldog face. "You found a rare one, Ellie," Boone said softly. "I know," Eleanor said. Boone picked up his pen. He dipped it in the inkwell. "Sign here," the judge directed. Eleanor took the pen first. She didn't hesitate. She signed her name with the same fierce, precise strokes she used in her ledger. Eleanor Margaret Montgomery. She handed the pen to Harrison. Harrison took it. He looked at her signature. Then, right beside it, he signed his own. Harrison James Caldwell. The ink dried. The deal was struck. Zeke stepped forward and added his sprawling, shaky signature as the official witness. Boone stamped the document with his heavy seal. "It's done," Boone declared. "Filed and binding. The Double M is officially a joint partnership." He stood up and offered his hand. Harrison shook it. Eleanor shook it. "Good luck to you both," Boone said. "Though, looking at the two of you, I don't think luck has a damn thing to do with it." They walked out of the courthouse. The heat of the street hit them like a physical blow. Harrison walked to the post office next door. Eleanor watched from the boardwalk as he handed the sealed envelope, his letter to Wyoming, to the postmaster. He paid the postage. He watched it go into the outgoing canvas bag. He walked back out. His hands were empty. "It's gone," Harrison said. "Good," Eleanor said. They mounted their horses. They rode out of Cimarron. They didn't ride fast. They let the horses walk. The shadows began to lengthen as the afternoon wore on. The harsh glare of the sun softened, turning the dusty sky a bruised purple and burnt orange. When they crossed the property line onto the Double M, Harrison didn't turn toward the main yard. He pulled his horse to the right. "Where are you going?" Eleanor asked. "Up," Harrison said. He pointed toward the northern ridge. Eleanor smiled, a small, rare thing. She turned her horse and followed him. They rode up the steep, rocky incline. The horses breathed hard. When they reached the crest of the ridge, they stopped. The wind was strong up here. It whipped Eleanor's hair around her face. It cooled the sweat on Harrison's neck. Below them, the Double M stretched out, an empire of grass and water. They could see the silver ribbon of the creek winding through the lower pasture. They could see the dark shapes of the cattle grazing. They could see the smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney. It was massive. It was brutal. It was beautiful. Eleanor looked at it. This was the exact spot she had stood 9 years ago. Samuel had been dead a month. The fever was still fresh in her mind. Silas was already making noise about selling the herd. She had stood on this ridge, completely alone, and promised the dirt that she would not break. She hadn't broken, she had bled, she had fought, but she had held the line. She turned her head, she looked at Harrison. He was watching the herd, his eyes tracking the movement of the cattle, calculating, planning, caring. He felt her looking at him. He turned his head. He didn't say anything. There were no grand declarations left to make. The contracts were signed. The letters were sent. The truth was out in the open. Harrison reached across the space between their saddles. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't pull her to him. He just offered his hand. Palm up, thick with calluses, stained with forge soot and leather oil. Eleanor looked at his hand. She took off her riding glove. She reached out. She placed her bare hand in his, her own calluses pressing against his. He closed his fingers around hers, a solid, unbreakable grip. They sat there on the ridge, holding on to each other, and looked down at the world they had chosen to hold together. The sun dipped below the mountains. The sky caught fire. And for the first time in 9 years, Eleanor Montgomery wasn't holding the sky up all by herself. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you stories of the Wild West. Cowboys, love, sacrifice, motherhood, and the quiet compassion that binds people together across the harshest lands. The lesson here is simple. Dignity comes from what you build, not what others say you deserve. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more powerful stories like this. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
As the dust settles over the Double M Ranch, what remains is not just a victory over one man's greed, but a quiet, enduring truth about the human spirit. Eleanor Montgomery did not win because the law suddenly became fair, nor because the world decided to recognize her worth. She won because she refused to let silence define her, because she understood that dignity is not granted. It is claimed, protected, and proven through action. In a land as unforgiving as the frontier, where survival itself is a daily negotiation with nature, her story reminds us that the greatest battles are not always fought with guns or fists, but with persistence, clarity, and the courage to stand firm when everything around you demands that you yield. This story carries a deeper lesson about the nature of respect and recognition. Too often, the world overlooks the labor that happens quietly, the sacrifices made without applause, the strength that does not announce itself. Eleanor's journey shows us that true value does not lie in titles, in ownership papers, or in the approval of others. It lies in the work we do when no one is watching, and in the integrity we maintain when it would be easier to compromise. Her ledger was not just a record of numbers. It was a testament to her existence, her effort, and her undeniable contribution to something larger than herself. And in the end, truth, when backed by courage, has a weight that no lie can carry for long. There is also a powerful reflection here on accountability and redemption. Harrison Caldwell's transformation reminds us that strength is not the absence of failure, but the willingness to confront it. He chose to step away from comfort, to face his own silence, and to stand publicly for the truth, even when it cost him his pride. That choice, difficult as it was, speaks to a fundamental human value, that it is never too late to do what is right. In a world that often rewards self-preservation, choosing integrity becomes an act of quiet rebellion. And perhaps most importantly, this story speaks to the idea of human connection, of seeing and acknowledging one another when the rest of the world turns away. Zeke's journal, Josiah's loyalty, and Eleanor's unwavering belief in honest labor all point to a simple but profound truth. A society cannot survive on power and law alone. It survives on trust, on respect, and on the recognition of each person's worth. When we fail to honor that, we risk losing not just fairness, but our humanity itself. So what does this story leave us with? It leaves us with the understanding that strength is not loud, that justice is not automatic, and that dignity must often be defended against the very systems meant to protect it. It reminds us that real change begins when individuals refuse to accept the roles imposed on them, and instead choose to define themselves through their actions. And above all, it teaches us that even in the harshest conditions, compassion, resilience, and truth can take root. And when they do, they have the power to reshape everything around them.